While the concept of safety has similarities across organizations and industries, different people experience safety differently based on their lived experiences. In honor of National Women's History Month, we'll talk with a pioneer in the fight to ensure that women are both treated safely and able to participate in the safety profession on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Well, welcome to this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety, as well as learning from the lived experiences and expertise and research of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. It's true that safety and how safety programming is implemented, it actually should be equal and equitable in an organization. But the reality is this isn't the case in every case. This includes the safety profession. As a matter of fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics suggests that 51.7% of the workforce is female. But according to Zippia.com, only 27.2% of the occupational health and safety specialists in the country are female. So this suggests that the policies, procedures, practices relative to safety are often created for and by men. This discrepancy sometimes creates some challenges in terms of how those policies and procedures and practices affect people that aren't men. And my guest today certainly has some understanding, awareness, expertise, and background in that arena. From her service in the federal government to her work on national safety organizations and as a safety professional and expert witness, she's been a trailblazer, laser focused on the safety of all people, but certainly on the safety of women and safety of women in the safety profession. So let's get right into it with my opening question to each of my guests. And in this case, the question is, who is Rose McMurray?
Well, Dr. Daniels, I'll answer that in a moment. But what I'd first like to do is suggest to you that what a privilege it is for you to include me in this important information about Women's History Month and the role that safety plays in women's lives. Your work in this area has been trailblazing itself, and I want to congratulate you for raising awareness of this and putting a spotlight on the importance of treating the entire worker, not just the physical safety of the worker, but as well the mental attitude and feelings that they bring into the workplace. So I'll turn my answer over to your provocative question, who is Rose McMurray? And that's a very difficult question, and I'm surprised you started out with that. That's supposed to be a softball, that first question. So this is a hard one. I guess I would describe myself in different ways, depending upon who you ask about who I am. I'm a mother. I have 2 adult children, been married to the same man for 48 years. My family would probably say I care about them and I nurture them and I look out for their welfare. I think they would also say I'm hardworking, ambitious, and I really love my career in safety. It's something that's been so gratifying to me. And they live the result of that mindset when I'm always pointing out things that they can do differently, like climbing on ladders, or getting into a vehicle. And so they've lived with me with that orientation for a long time. My colleagues would probably call me demanding and having high expectations, but I also think they would call me fair. And I know this because I've asked them through my career. I've felt it important that I get that feedback candid feedback about what I could do differently to support them. So I usually get that same adjective, that demanding but fair. So I'll take that. That to me is okay. Um, I would say that I'm a very grateful person generally. I wake up every morning and I feel like, thank you, God, for all you've given me in the way of blessings and health and a great life. I feel like I've been a witness to history. I was born in the 1950s and I was able to just be affected by, or I was affected by things like assassinations of presidents, Dr. King, all of the societal movements, the Me Too movement, the women's movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all of these huge societal movements that really kind of framed who I am. And I'm a believer in social justice. I march with the Women's March. I march with the pro-choice people, the gun control people. I just feel like we have an obligation to one another to make their lives better and to raise awareness of these bigger societal issues. I grew up in the Rust Belt in northern West Virginia near Pittsburgh in Ohio. I saw in the steel mills workers getting injured unnecessarily, my relatives getting injured. I decided that I would leave that area and I would go into public service because I always thought I could maybe work on big issues, things that really could change the lives of people. So I had a career in government for 38 years and I loved it. I didn't start out loving it so much, but I grew to love it better. And it gave me the opportunity to travel, to meet other people, and to work on international issues as well. And then, of course, my role with the National Safety Council, which I loved because it broadened my understanding of human behavior. So not only was I working in my field, which was road safety, I also started to learn more about opioid addiction and poisonings and slips and falls and other things that workers confront both at home and at the workplace. So I feel well-rounded as a safety expert and I keep learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I love new things. I changed jobs when I was not retired. And I liked the challenge of new opportunities and new things that needed to be addressed. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I am. And I'm sure I've forgotten other things like my bad points, but you'll probably bring those out, Dr. Daniels.
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, that is that's a lot of what I expected to hear because at least in the opportunities we've had to work together, I particularly connect with that lifelong learner concept because it's just good to see people who are not, though they have experiences themselves, some of them turned out the way we expect and some not. There's this constant search for what's next and this constant search for how can I be a better contributor? How can I, be a better friend and mother and father and all the other various roles? And how can we be better at that? And so, we'll get into probably a few of those details as we continue the conversation. So tell me a little bit about your feelings regarding psychological health and safety. What is that? When you hear that, what does that mean to you?
It means to me that as leaders, we have an obligation to recognize that the person that is working alongside us have not only the need to be physically safe at work, but as well that they come to work fit mentally and prepared to work because they're in a collegial environment in which they feel safe. We have obligations to train people to be safe, but we don't really focus on the well-being or how people present when they arrive at the workplace. To recognize they have home lives, they have challenges off the job that they necessarily bring into the workplace. So I think as leaders, we need to observe people. We need to see if people appear to be struggling. We need to have conversations with them and understand what's going on with them. And I'll give you an example. When I was a fairly new manager in my 20s, I had a secretary who worked for me, and she was unfortunately consistently late. So I sat down with her one day and said, I really need you here full time. You're a single mother of a young child, and I understand you have challenges. Well, she finally broke down and told me what her off the job life was like. She lived in a high crime area of Washington, D.C. She was a single mother. She was making a very low grade in government. And there was a lot of violence around her neighborhood, and what she had to do to get to work was such a challenge. And it
Mm,
opened my eyes
mm,
about, here I am, the privileged white woman coming from the suburbs in my car, parking in the parking garage. And this young lady had to struggle just to get to work and to get
mm,
home.
mm,
So I was able to adjust her job in order to give her more peace of mind about what was going on at home and to get to work safely. So I think we have to be observant as leaders, and we have to help people be successful.
mm.
And so I think that we have to recognize that and address it, and not just bury it under the rug, but help people if they're willing to be helped and want to talk about their situation. But I just think we have to give equal weight to that issue.
That yes, yes, yeah. So that again, that story again just encapsulates my experience of meeting you. And when I first started showing up um, at these big events with safety professionals from all over the country, and it's intimidating, to be quite honest. That you walk and there's the vice president of safety from such and such a place, and the chief safety officer from this organization, and I felt like I had a pretty decent background, but it was like, whoa, people I've like heard of, and the OSHA administrator shows up, and the folks from NIOSH and all these folks. But I noticed, at least as we got to interact a little bit, that you seem to be very focused on the concept of including everybody, and not simply having folks in the room, but how are they included in the conversation? And the story that you just told is so important, that we, that you notice that someone, it started off a little bit as kind of a performance and showing up thing, but there's something behind that. And often those conversations get had. People make assumptions. Well, they just need to be here, and I can get here, and if I can, how come they can't? And that's a skill that not everyone possesses, but it's a skill that's actually very important. So talk a little bit more, and again, particularly as I said, you are. This is not to be tokenistic by any stretch of the imagination, but I specifically wanted to talk to you at the beginning of Women's History Month because of the stories that I've heard you tell and the things I've seen you do relative to making sure that people who gender identify similar to you have a safe environment based on their circumstances, not based on what a bunch of guys thought. So talk a little bit more about maybe even some of the challenges that you experienced, coming up in the federal government and these big organizations and big meetings and whatnot. And you probably ended up like me. Sometimes you walk in the room and feel like you were the only person in the room who had your story. So share a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that's a very insightful question. I started work in the 70s when women simply weren't present in executive positions, and I had done academically well in college, and I was an early feminist. I truly believed that, if I were to get ahead, I had to outperform men, right? So I worked hard, and I wouldn't settle. I wouldn't settle for jobs that were offered to me that were basically clerical in nature. And I was assertive. I would ask the question, is this a job you would offer a male applicant? And oftentimes I'd get these dumbfounded, you know, responses. And sometimes I would get pushback about, well, who do you think you are, lady? To ask that question. But I wouldn't settle. I knew my worth. I knew what I had done. I knew that I would not allow myself, to the extent I could control it, be treated differently.
Mm,
And it was hard to do, but I think I had some success at that. The other thing is, in the workplace, you always had to prove that you were there, not as a function of diversity quotas or affirmative action, but in fact, you earned this, you earned this position. And you had to be competent, you had to be overcompetent, you had to really hone your craft so that when you did open your mouth to participate with all male contingent of meeting goers, that what you said was accurate, was fulsome, was based on data and evidence. And in the safety area, it was important that you know your stuff, you know your data. And so I felt like I would not easily but slowly be accepted into the group. And then as I continued my sort of trajectory up, I had more authority. I had more ability to influence outcomes and hiring and diversity. And I was the kind that needed change. So every 3 years I changed jobs, and they were executive jobs. And each time it was, all right, how does she get here? Is she worthy of our acceptance and our fidelity? So I think I proved that. But I had confidence, and I maybe even at times when I didn't feel so confident, I was confident. I also was sensitive to people's stories, women's stories about what they had to go through. And I was pretty lucky that I didn't have a lot of bullying or intimidation, but I did feel the undertones of, again, why are you here, and did you deserve to be here? My daughter's kind of a good example. She's in her early 40s, and in college and in other earlier in her life, she had jobs that were mainly in fast food and typical kind of teenage jobs. And she told me that she had never in all her career ever had a job where she was not sexually harassed.
Wow.
And that it was so awkward for her that she had to develop strategies never to be alone with the boss, right? And to keep her head down. And her personality, she would tell me, would change. She'd go into work. Of course, she wasn't an ideal situation, and she would keep her head down and try to avoid the boss or bosses. And I thought, how terrible that instead of looking forward to work, she had to repress who she was. We all had that. I think women kind of accepted that it was par for the course to be flirted with, to be underestimated, to again have to continuously prove our worth, and always this suspicion, this doubt: are you really here for the right reasons? So I'm not sure I answered your question, David. I probably went down a rabbit hole there, but I just think that you have to be resilient and persevere, and you have to look out for the women around you and see what's happening with them.
Absolutely. No, you certainly did. I a lot of it sounds familiar. It sounds familiar. Anytime you find yourself in a situation where you are not the majority, or at least I found my experience has been when I've not been the majority, there are these coping skills that you almost have to develop to be a part. And the conversation we're having, as a country and in many industries around diversity, equity, and inclusion is interesting. I mean, it's interesting that, it's taken us, all these years to finally come around to. It's great, but it's still a challenge, because the words are there sometimes, so you talked about early in your career when the words weren't even there and you're able to kind of elbow your way in. But sometimes the words are there, but the feeling still isn't. It's even sometimes I think people are trying, but there's just something that's kind of missing. And it goes back to the point I made before that the system was made for a certain group of people. And we don't often go back to the systems themselves and say, look, conversation earlier about how workers get to work and whether or not they show up and what time they show up. Some of these, in my view, almost old school views of things were set up by men because at the time it worked for them. And it doesn't necessarily work just because, for all kinds of reasons, really, circumstances have changed, situations have changed. So tell me, pray tell, it couldn't have been this way when you started in the safety community though, right? They were certainly all open and wanted you to be there, right?
Well, David, I would say I was an accidental safety person. I didn't talk too much about my history, but I actually came up through the Defense Department's internship program. And I'm telling you, it was fabulous. I learned more about infrastructure and management systems that when I had the chance to leave it, because it wasn't very nurturing at that time for women. It was post-Vietnam. There was a lot of stigma there. And I went into the Department of Transportation, and it was like nirvana for me. There were women in the workplace. There were young people in the workplace. The mission was more compatible with my need to work on big national issues, and so what I found was that my practical skill was missing in where I was working. I was working in transit at the time, and I just moved like quickly through the system because I had, again, this ability that my colleagues didn't have. And I became a manager early on. So I really had a lot of mentoring and encouragement to exploit, I think, the talent that I had. So I was I came up through budget, finance, controller, management systems, procurement. And between the Bush and Clinton administrations, I was left in charge. I was left in charge of a safety program. And I had been the admin support guru for all my career. And I said, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? This is technical stuff. This is technical. It was hazardous materials and it was pipeline safety. It was very male dominated. And I said, I've got to rise to the challenge. I have got to, I have to immerse myself in safety. I listened when I was at the executive table. I enabled because I got them the money they needed to do their jobs, safety folks. Now I had to represent the agency before Congress, before the executive branch. And so I just immersed myself. I just said, I got to do it because I can't let these people down. So was there doubt? There was a lot of doubt from my male safety guys who said, what do you know? What do you know about safety? But I learned it. I testified before Congress. And then I realized I really love this field. And so after that, I became kind of known as maybe admin budget safety woman. And so after that point, I moved on totally into safety and eventually got what I would call the crown jewel of the Department of Transportation's programs, and that was all of the road safety portfolio. Drunk driving, seatbelts, children, adults, judicial reform, EMS training, firefighter training, all child passenger safety, all the behavior of motorists on the road, pedestrians, motorcyclists, older people, younger people, graduate. So the whole kit and caboodle was mine. And boy, that was an incredible challenge and an incredible learning period for me. So I became, like I said, an accidental safety professional. And then I widened my exposure by joining the National Safety Council and learning about the bigger issues of behavior and why people do what they do and when they don't do what they should do in their own self-interest. So I just, somebody up there was looking out for me because they let me have this path that led me to this wonderful career I have.
Oh boy. So let's pull a little bit on that thread regarding how people behave, because let's take our transportation system. Again, it is likely that the folks who designed the interstate highway system, that the vast majority of them were men. It is likely, and I don't know this to be true because I don't have one. It is likely, though, that the manual for uniform traffic control devices and the EMS training processes and the commercial driver licensing system, and it is likely that most of those systems were designed for and by men. So, and probably middle-class Christian cis male white men, probably, just based on the times. So how did you start to figure out, or did you know that innately, that these systems that have been created, and when folks are doing things in their communities and in their lives, that it wasn't that they were bad people, it's just we had system incompatibility, that the system was made for a particular group and other people just were different. I mean, how did that realization come to you, or was it natural for you?
I think it mainly came to me when I had the position of trying to raise seatbelt use and reduce the carnage on the highways for people not wearing their seatbelt. So I realized that I had a lot of women on my staff, which I loved, and I had a pretty diverse staff, but not completely as diverse as I would have liked. And so we would brainstorm a great deal. We had to be so creative about how do we get, the Hispanic single woman to agree to put her baby in a child seat when the culture said good mothers hold their babies in the car when they drive. And they had the experience of having, the mother-in-law really reinforcing that that's what good mothers do. So I realized that we didn't have the right people around the table to think through this. We didn't have enough older people, younger people, Hispanic people, handicapped people that were, and they were and those who were socioeconomic less advantaged, because the people working in government were middle class people, whether they were people of color, women or men. We didn't have the whole perspective. So we brought in focus groups, we brought in people that could give us a different perspective, and then we developed solutions. So for this example I gave you, the Hispanic mother, we partnered with the Catholic Church in Texas, and we provided free car seats, and we developed a campaign for a certain Sunday. The people would come to church and they would be receiving blessed, holy water blessed seats, and we would give them away. And then the priest would engage in the issue about good mothers put their children in child seats. So we had to be very inventive. And I had a fabulous staff who helped think through all that. Same thing with drunk driving, impaired driving, drug driving. How do you get to the populations that don't hear it because they're not hearing it through the right channels? How do you find the culturally competent spokespeople who can say, this is why this is important? Racial profiling, we dealt with that in the South during Buckle Up America, because the Southern law enforcement pushed back on this national mobilization because it was another pretext to stop Black motorists. You don't have your seatbelt on. How do we overcome that? So we engaged NOBLE, which was the National Organization of Black Law Executives, and Southern police chiefs to figure out a way to overcome that concern. It wasn't always successful, but we knew that government was seen as the problem. Government was not seen as a solution in certain cases. So we just had to be inventive, because when you look at the goal, you think nothing's off the table. Nothing's off the table, because you have an obligation to address, injury and death, on the highways. And we have to be creative, and we have to bring in as many diverse views as we can. And we need to listen. Listen.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Wow, I can't say that I'd ever heard about the blessed baby seats, child seats. but that's just so creative. It's taking safety to people where they are. and not trying to drag people out of their communities and out of their lives and out of their situations and make them fit, but have the system fit for them. I just think that's so, wow, that talk about being ahead of your time. I guess I wonder why we aren't even further ahead then. Why is it that we're still having so many struggles and challenges with, because as you look at the data, there isn't a single industry that I've found yet where women and people of color don't get injured more often than their white male counterparts in every industry. And I go back to this belief that the systems themselves were not designed for diverse populations, but they can be altered, because you just shared examples of how, regardless to how it was designed, that doesn't fit this group. So how do we change it to fit this group? How do we change it? Because if ultimately the goal is to create a safe environment for everybody, it has to be tailored for that person and how they see the world. Wow, I'm going to remember the blessed baby seat. So, share a little bit about some of your leadership activities around helping safety professionals, particularly women, get into the safety profession. This is one of the major connecting points for us is that you're one of the founding mothers of the women's division of the National Safety Council. And again, I've shared with you. So when I came, there weren't a lot of people. There weren't a lot of Black people at a lot of the conferences when I was going. And I felt this kinship because I go and hear what was going on in the women's caucus at the time and go like, I'm with this. I'm not a woman, but I feel the same kinds of or similar kinds of challenges, I would say, and sometimes felt that just this kinship with the group. So it kind of keeps showing up, and but share a little bit about what that was like to be able to go to a big organization and go, hey, where are the women's safety professionals and how do we get them more involved? Talk a little bit about that story.
Well, first of all, I want to commend you yet again for having the courage to infiltrate that group of women professionals. And we always consider Dr. Daniels as one of us. And as you say, your experiences were very similar to some of the challenges that women faced. And it's difficult, as someone who by nature is assertive and confident. My biggest challenge was dealing with women who did not have the confidence to be active and to feel like they belong or know their value. So it's a certain amount of timidity that I would see. And I know I'm not for everyone, so in standing up in front of a group of women and talking about this is the way I did it. It's not the way everybody should do it. I got lucky. I had a great spouse. I had a great family situation. But I know that people are positioned differently than I was. So I often get a reaction after those kinds of discussions that, geez, I really learned something about standing up for myself, knowing my value, and maybe I'm in the wrong organization. I almost always make the connection between if you, as women or men, go to work and you are miserable, when you get in that vehicle or you get in that bus and you go to work and you say, I really hate this job. It ain't for you. If you have the wherewithal, there are organizations that are nurturing, that are accommodating to you, that are easier, and you can be successful in that environment. Perhaps you're in an environment where there are too many challenges, too many systemic, institutionalized barriers to you being successful. I started out, as I said, in the Defense Department. Didn't work for me. Didn't like the white male militaristic mindset. So I said, I have to find something else. And I, as I said, went to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and I said, these are my people. I can be somebody here. And so I say, don't settle. If you can. And I know it's not easy for everyone to do that, but keep searching for a place that's going to value you, respect you, let you contribute. And and let you be your best self.
Wow. That could go on a t-shirt, a bumper sticker, uh, because no, I agree with you wholeheartedly. There are a lot of folks, and again, I've had situations in my life. I mean, the one that was the worst is, I was in, I found myself driving to work in tears. I was 50, driving to work, it was just miserable, and it's difficult sometimes when that's going on to not start doubting yourself, and wonder, well, maybe it's me. And no, actually, it's not you. It's actually the environment, because I this kind of have this view that most people are good people. Most people get up and they get up in the morning, they go about trying to take care of whatever their needs are that particular day. And it's not their intention to hurt other people. And sadly, even in some of these organizations that are they're a little stodgy and old school, it's not because they're bad people, it's because that's comfortable for them. The challenge or the question is it comfortable for you? And how long do you, and I'm just, I'm really motivated and excited by what you said, that we all have to decide for ourselves, how does it work for me? And how comfortable is it for me? And maybe I can't change this organization, so maybe I need to change me. Maybe that's the issue. I need to go someplace, because we all have that space that we can get in where we would feel safer and we would feel more supported. So just to get again another example of how how ahead of your time you you were, because this is not a conversation that we were having. This whole conversation about psychological safety and all that type of thing seems to be contemporary, but it's actually been around for many, many years. So as we continue to delve here, this innate, I want to feel safe, I feel good about being here. If I'm not, I'm going to move on. That took a lot of courage. So is there some particular thing that happened in your life, or is this really just your upbringing and the people that you're around that caused you to feel that, that convinced about taking care of your own feelings and your own emotional health?
Well, I think maybe an oversimplified answer is, if I'm not feeling it, I don't want to feel that way anymore. I want to get up in the morning and be looking forward to the day. And as you said, at age 50, you found yourself tearful going to work. I mean, why? How wonderful. That the brain was telling your physical self, this may not be for me. And so I just think I had options. Because I was in the government. The federal government, in my view, has always kind of led the way on societal change when it comes to big issues. So, in the 70s, there was a big push to get women into the Defense Department. I did it. I didn't work, but I knew I was in the government, and I knew I had a chance to springboard into something bigger. So when you're in a federal employee or a state employee, you may have options to move around. It may not be as easy as people in the private sector. But your mind is telling you something, and you need to act or be miserable. And I choose not to be miserable. I'd rather not work than be miserable. But
Right.
That's because I have the wherewithal to be able to do that.
Right.
And so I don't want to say one size fits all, but your mind is telling you something here. When you talked about the Women's Caucus and being like the first chair of that caucus, and getting to know the women in the National Safety Council who had line jobs, not staff jobs like I had always had, but actually the construction worker, the firefighter, the paramedic, the first responder, the electrical worker. And I listened to their stories. And what I found with a lot of those women was they had become masculinized. And what I mean by that is that they were tough talking, because they had to adjust to the environment they were in. And I would never say to them, you need to change occupations, but I could see that they had to go into work with this mindset of, I got to be one of the guys. I don't want to disrupt the ambiance they feel because some woman or some, Black person or some person of color has infiltrated their white male, comfortable situation where we can curse and talk about women and everything else. Okay. Here you are, you're a disruptor, you don't belong here. So the bullying begins and the feelings of inadequacy begin. I don't know what to say to women like that. I feel it for them. I feel that how awful it would be to do this, but they love the work. So what do you tell them? Persevere, know your job. Someone told me a long time ago that the best defense against isms, sexism, racism, is competence. Competence. Know yourself, again, accept that, or push the fact that you belong here because you're competent to do the job. Easier said than done, I know. And I don't mean to oversimplify it.
Absolutely. Right.
But I mean, I learned a lot from those women about what they have to deal with every day. Women in the military. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. Almost every day there's an article in the Washington Post about the challenges women have in the military, challenges women have. Just this morning, Google, Meta laying off mainly women and minorities because they're the last in to be hired. We have it tough. We underrepresented groups have it difficult because, we are still in the white male power structure.
Sure.
But you know what? You just got to believe you belong and you got to show them that you belong because you know what? To ignore your talent is a mistake. And we know that organizations that are diverse are more profitable and more successful.
Absolutely.
The data bears it out.
So there are, again, as I shared early on, that there are organizations and conversations out there, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and, the reckoning that we're having around, just diversity in general, the Me Too movement, other, things that have happened in just recent years that have, and because the thing that's different now is we know about these movements and these issues so much quicker than we did, even 20 years ago. We just know about them and they have an impact on us that is more immediate. So imagine that there are folks watching or listening who I really want to do better. I'm in a position of leadership. I know this system is just not what I want it to be. And I know you've been in leadership before and you've created these kinds of environments. So what kinds of tips and things could you share with people? I want to do this. I know this is important. Where do I start?
Great question. Well, I think you have to do a really sincere and honest examination of your organization and what might be the barriers, the systemic institutionalized barriers to creating the environment you want to create. You critically examine whether hiring is done well, whether recruitment is done well, whether compensation is fair across the board. So you kind of find the things that need to be reformed. But I think you have to engage the people above you and the people below you that the environment that you contemplate is achievable, and it's going to take work, it's going to take buy-in, it's going to take resources perhaps. And then you lay out the path, you lay out the plan, and you hopefully can start to erode some of those barriers that have kept people, not fully contributing. And I think it's important to have groups to sit down with employees and management and talk these things through. I mean, there should be no shame in talking about what's wrong here. What's unsettling people? What are people thinking about? And I think it is probably intimidating to the status quo folks, the white men who you rightly characterize as having built that system that we're all operating in. I think that some of the important things are, you have to have an organization, in my view, that looks like America, looks like people. So like a DOT I mentioned, I loved it because there were a lot of women. and until women are like 51%, of of the workforce, you're always going to see women as, you know, perhaps not as competent. But you have to see it, and you have to build it, and you have to intentionally go for that. Like I said, I was in a management development program and I think like 60% of us were women. Why was that? To build the pipeline of competence and build the pipeline of talent that could one day be appointed to some of these executive positions. We had a lot of women in management jobs, and just like legislation, legislation can force change. Obviously, these policies and the adherence to the policies create change. You just have to keep at it.
Right.
And I was always one, to kind of push leadership. And it was mainly, I always worked for political people. Some were Democrats, some were Republicans, some were open, some were not open. And I just would try to build an awareness of how the job required, or the mission of the agency required, a diverse perspective and a diverse contribution. Because otherwise, we're not going to hit the mark. We're not going to save lives on the roadways if we don't understand what people are dealing with, like old cars, for example. People had to buy old cars that were not equipped with advanced safety features because that's all they could afford. Didn't have airbags. Oh, geez, They get in a crash. So how do we fix that? How can we fix that? How do we buy those cars and get those cars off the road and give people a more advanced safety situation? So you have to just really examine. That doesn't answer the question about the environment in the workplace, but it does say our mission is broad, our mission is important. We have to include every aspect of it to create change in the outcome we want.
Sure. Wow. Oh boy. It's and I find myself often when I have folks in these conversations, it's just inspiring to hear these thoughts that are coming about not only the challenges that we've had and how we've overcome them, but how we can change things in the future. We don't have to, things that don't work for us, and whoever us is, if they don't work for us as human beings, we can change them if we want to enough. We can. It doesn't have to stay that way. And changing things doesn't mean that the old system was terrible or bad. It just doesn't work for me. It just don't work for my experience, for what I'm trying to achieve. So we need to expand the way we look at that thing and change the way we and have folks not get clutching their pearls about the way we've always done it. It's just not working for everybody. Well
said, David. And you'll remember that when we started the Women's Caucus, we had some definite plans, one of which was to recognize women in safety with the Marion Martin Award.
Absolutely.
It was simple as pushing for that recognition in front of the audience, which is primarily white male, to say, these are the women trailblazers in safety. These are the women who are achieving success in safety. PPE, personal protective equipment. We set about to raise awareness of the fact that women in high hazard jobs were wearing PPE that were designed for men and not designed for women. So they were ill-fitting, and they put them at risk on the job because they didn't. So we sent a group to kind of work with the manufacturers and the apparel providers to recognize that. So there's more movement on that front. So you have to have a plan. You have to put resources and energy behind it, put the right people in it. And I think, yes, is it big? Is it huge? No, but it's incremental, and it shows, we are looking out for ourselves. We're looking out for others who need to be looked out for, who don't have the voice. We have the voice. We use the voice the best we can.
So I'd like to conclude the conversation with a question, putting you again back in the seat of a consultant. There are 30 countries around the world who have regulations and have policies around psychological health and safety that it they focus on safety from a broader perspective than we do here in the US. And so the OSH Act does a pretty decent job of addressing physical and chemical and biological and all the other hazards that we can actually see. So for those of us who are interested someday in seeing the United States also see psychosocial hazards as a thing, what would you tell us? Given your experience with the federal government, with these big systems, what kind of, what would you advise us? How would you advise us?
Well, I think if there are models, programs out there, you mentioned 30-some countries who do a good job at this. What is it about their government, their culture, that makes that psychosocial importance an important national value? Okay, what was it about those countries? Are they liberal countries? Are they democratic countries? What is it? What can we learn from how they did it? And then I think I think we're seeing the evidence of like workplace violence. We're seeing these issues just getting the kind of attention that they needed to be given. Like just in the last week, some of the workplace violence in California. We know about these. This is a harder one to get your arms around because you don't see it. You see, the person exposed to the chemical hazard and how do we mitigate, that person's exposure. But we don't see what people come into the workplace with. And then when we see it, what do we do? And I've contemplated this before. When information comes out about mass killers, and they say, "Wow, there were all these symptoms." You had, he was cruel to animals. He didn't get along with people. He was a loner. He didn't. And you think, okay, all right, we all know people like this, but what do? We can't put everybody who's a loner and who doesn't get along with people and who may have issues with animals in an institution somewhere.
Right.
So how do you predict what this person could do? And if you think that they are likely to be violent, what wherewithal do you have to address it? Because there's also the freedom the person has not to be institutionalized, unless they show evidence, some concrete. So I don't have a good answer for that. What do you do other than study what were the precursors that led these countries to create these regulations and these standards? And I'm going to say they're not going to be very different than what we see. We have the problem. We have a huge problem. So and then in our case, we have everything, all the environment around this, which is easy access to guns, a lack of psychological resources in our medical, in our health insurance system. I mean, it's a lot of barriers. But you know what? You got to have a blueprint, and you got to figure out how to go about it. And you got to get political will. And there's so many issues our country faces. How does this fit in? But OSHA is the one, and SAMHSA, and all of these. And I'm a big federal believer. Obviously, I believe in big change, fix the big problems, legislate, educate, enforce, make visible what you're trying to achieve, and it's going to take a long time. Smoking, wearing seatbelts, look how long it took for those to become socially ostracized if you engaged, in not wearing a seatbelt or smoking. It's hard. I don't have a magic answer other than, work with the groups that have this as their aim, work on the legislators to get them to see, what you see and what needs to be done, and then just ratchet away at it. But have that goal very clear.
Absolutely.
At the end. That's what we did with seatbelts. We got up to 90% seatbelt use, which was extraordinary. But then we started to look at all of the stuff that we had done, getting the blood alcohol concentration passed by the states, lower it from 0.10 to 0.08. That took a lot of political attention. And what worked? Legislation that would penalize the states financially if they didn't pass the law. You want to use the carrot. You really prefer to use the carrot to incentivize change. but sometimes after the carrot, is gnawed off to the end of the stem,
Yeah.
you got to go for the stick, and the stick unfortunately works a little more successfully than the carrot in some cases.
Some cases.
So you just have to cleave with the others and work toward the same outcome.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Rose McMurray, it's always a wonderful opportunity to chat with you about all kinds of topics, particularly topics that are safety related. And I know you do some, you still do some consulting work, and so what types of things are you into now and into the future, and how can people reach out to you if they want to do that?
Sure. Well, I do two things. I'm an independent consultant, kind of like you are, David, and then I also have a company affiliation. So I'm doing a lot of litigation right now. I only think I even mentioned my primary expertise is in truck safety, in big rig and passenger vehicles. So I do a lot of expert witness testimony, reports, advice to litigants, both defendants and plaintiffs. And I love that. Oh, I love that work. Because it's also my chance to educate, and I discover companies that aren't really up to snuff, and things that they're not doing and they don't know they have to do. So that concerns me. I was teaching for a while. I'm not teaching right now, but I was teaching safety compliance and teaching motor fleet safety. I do consulting. I do all kinds of things, and I travel. I love to travel. I'm retired full time, so I can balance my litigation work, consulting work, and traveling. Because when I mentioned I'm a lifelong learner, I learn a lot when I go to other countries and I see how people live. And I didn't mention I had been in Chernobyl. I had a wonderful career, David. I just had and one of them included Chernobyl, and seeing the effects that radiation had on people and their lives, and their risk awareness of how they were exposed to radiation, and the thought about how much life they had left. I just there's just a lot that we can experience in our lives, and I think that keeping a balance is the most important. And I have that. I've always pretty much had that, and fortunate. I'm very grateful.
Absolutely.
I'm grateful for you, David.
Well, thanks, Rose, and thanks for taking some time to hang out with us. And I think folks are going to really enjoy just contemplating some of the nuggets of wisdom that you shared with us. And but again, as much as you and I could probably carry on the conversation for another couple of hours, I don't know if everybody will continue to hang out with us. So we're going to call this conversation to a close. And again, thanks so much for your candor and expertise and the contribution you've made to the safety profession in specific, and to just to humanity in general, because it's important to have folks in positions of authority and influence to do things that make the world a better place for all of us. So again, thanks very much for those of you who've listened in this week. Again, every week we come to you with a new guest talking about some aspect of psychological health and safety. And this has been certainly another one of those wonderful opportunities. So join us again next week. We'll have another very interesting conversation. You can follow us predominantly on LinkedIn. You can follow us on our website, psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. You can certainly follow me. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn myself and some other platforms. But for this conversation, we're going to call it to a close, and thank you very much. And we'll see you next time on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.